guy reading it to you can't get through it. So just touch back on Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I have my old sword out, right? This one's been in retirement for a little while, so you guys will be blessed with. It's the New King James Version, not the English Standard. So I think everybody will be close to the same. If you're reading Old King James, it's really close. If you're reading New King James, then you'll be right with me. And if you have any questions, just, raise your hand, holler. That's what we're here. We're a community, right? The church is the people. We're here together to learn. So if you don't get it, somebody else is probably not getting it too. Okay? So without further ado, if everyone's got their spot, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Dramatic pause for effect. Okay, here we go. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. God does it, that men should fear before him. That which is has already been, and what is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to the animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes to the earth? So I perceived that nothing is better than that men should rejoice in his own work, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? All right. So there's a lot in there. Okay, if you guys didn't notice, he starts this one with a poem. You guys notice your words maybe shifted a little bit? He starts this one with a poem, and he gives a little introduction to the poem. And then if you notice through the poem there, what is the predominant thing that happens over and over and over again? Time. Time does. Absolutely time. Time over and over and over again. So a lot of times when people a lot of times when people, so this one's going to be all about time, right? Because he mentions it several times in this chapter where he's exploring the idea of what we think that we have control over in our lives, right? So when he says a time to be born and a time to die, what are those both subject to? Time. All this stuff is subject to time. Now, people, when they read poetry, they forget that the poet is trying to convey a thought through using many words, right? Something that I could say simply to you. A poet often will use many words to try to get it to affect you in a different way or a different place. Wherever you're sitting, the poet is trying to get everybody on the same level, so to speak. But if you're not listening to the poet, you won't hear what he's actually talking about. So you have to humble yourself a little bit to actually listen to what the teacher says and what he's saying. Because everything in his little poem here, he draws a contrast. He draws a positive contrast and a negative contrast. So if you say, there's a time to be born, is that a good thing? Yeah, it's a good thing. When you were born, was that a good thing? Yes, it was, right? We can all agree on that. What about when you die? Is that a good thing? Some might not think so, right? Yes, absolutely. Well, it doesn't, well, see, and that's the thing. That's what the author is doing. He's trying to get you to think about the time you were born and the time you'll die. And everything that happens in between. I've heard it said before that your life is more than a dash between two dates, right? But what he's doing here is he's summing everything that happens in between those two dates to a dash. You get it? Can you see it, what he's doing? Because when he says born, you die, you're born. Well, he says it the opposite way. He says you're born, you die, right? He says you plant, and then you pull it all up. What's the point in all that, right? Because if you look at either end of the spectrum, you're like, oh, well, what is all this? It's just vanity, right? It's just smoke. But what he wants to convey is the idea that all these things are subject to something. That something rules over all these things in our lives that we always forget about. And what is that thing? Well, it's God. And God is the author of time, right? So all these things, if they're subject to time, and God is the author of time, then who is ultimately in control of the story? Right. But we forget that. And we think, in the dashes, right? In the dashes, what is our life? We look at these things and we say, oh, being born is good and dying is terrible. Oh, we say planting, that's great, because I have hopeful anticipation in the plants that I'm going to grow, right? If anyone's been working in the garden like me, obsessively for the last week, that's all you focus on. It's just, this is what I got to do. This is the time for planting. This is the only thing that occupies me as a human being, right? This is my whole identity right now, is planting. And then when it comes time to harvest, guess what my whole identity becomes then? Harvesting, right? When I'm born, my whole identity becomes to become a human, right? And when I die, my whole identity becomes to leave that behind, right? There's a saying, I can't remember who said it, but they said, we all enter this world clenching onto something with our hands closed, with our fists closed. And we all leave it with our hands open, letting go, right? So is dying, could that be a bad thing? Well, it could be, because you've got to think who the author is actually writing to. He's writing to people with the wrong perspective. He's writing to people who see the world through this is all that you have. And if this is all that you have, this is an empty and shallow thing that you have, right? Because there's no substance to it. That's the idea of teaching smoke. And what he's doing is he's exploring every part in our life where we try to add substance to it, and it doesn't have any substance whatsoever. Because when we go and we think about time, on any given timeline, whatever it is that you're trying to hold on to is ultimate smoke. It's smoke that you're trying to hold on to. If you're trying to hold on to your identity as like the skater kid from the early 90s, right? Like me, this guy up here. If you're trying to hold on to that identity and you're 50 years old, I mean, come on, really? You just look like a big child, right? Because that's what people become. We become what we think we've made ourselves. And we try to seize our identity from the things that we put our effort into. And that's what he's doing, because he's throwing this, a time for this, a time for that, a time for this. And whatever you identify with on here, you're like, oh, casting away stones, that's great. Move all the rocks out of the way, right? Well, there's a time to put them back too, right? So that's what he's doing. He's exploring that poem to try to tell you something or teach you something that you may already know, but you don't want to accept, right? Because we all know this. We're the only creatures in all of creation that realize that we're going to die. That's what scientists say separates human beings from the animals. And then he kind of lumps us into this together at the end of the poem. So moving on from the poem, that's what he's trying to get at. And you can see where he ties a positive to a negative, right? And then he goes back and forth, up and down, left and right. And he's trying to confuse you to where the only thing you focus on is the part of time. And if you really stop and think about time long enough, how subject you are to it. Because when you think of the moment, when you try to think, let me rephrase. Okay, I'm getting it. Okay. So if you most of us spend the majority of our time either looking forward to the things that we hope to happen in our lives, right? Like my son right here. Pull him out as an example. He spends most of his time looking forward to the person that he'll become, in hopeful anticipation of the future that is about to come to him. Okay? And if I contrast it to the person sitting behind him and to his left, that person probably spends most of their time looking back to the day that they were like him. Now really think about that. Because that means that everybody sitting in this room never actually lives today. The today we're living is either spent in the future or it's spent in the yesterday that we thought we had. And when you actually try to grab onto your past and the memories of those past, how much substance is there really there? There's none. There's none, because even your memory of the past is skewed. What you remember of the past is actually your last memory of the last time you remembered the past. So that's why stories get embellished. You know that? Anybody ever play the telephone game where you tell that story and you say it to one person over and over again? Because you always add something to the memory. It's not real. And the only time you actually get to live is right here and right now. In between the dashes that the poet is pointing out. Right? Now there's value into thinking in the future. But ultimately, what happens to a person who spends the majority of their life looking to the future, and then that future is different from the future God has put before them? What do they do with that? When someone has the dream of becoming the story's all over the place. You pick anything. The guy who dreams of being the football player, the superstar football player who plays for the NFL, and all of a sudden he blows out his knee. And he can't play in the NFL. All of his dreams, his hopes, his desires have been dashed to pieces. And there's two paths that a man can take from that point. There's the path that leads to life, and there's the path that leads to death and destruction. Always. Because when a person rests all their hopes and desires into what they can make themselves, it's ultimately empty and vain. But the only thing we can really focus on, like Jesus said, why worry about tomorrow? Right? Today brings enough trouble. But we spend most of our time either looking back or looking forward, right? Into the person I will be or the person that I was. And the Bible says don't do that. Because the only time that you actually have is right now. And the only asset that you're truly limited on is your time. So if you waste it, what is that really saying about what you think about the time that you've been given? Okay, next question. Next question that the teacher poses here. That's just the first question. The next question that the teacher poses here is, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? Okay, now really think about it. He's posing a question out there, and he's saying, what profit do you really have in your work? Well, let's see if he answers it for us. Verse 10, I have seen the God-given tasks with which the sons of men are able to be occupied. Now he's already explored work and how if you set your identity into work, ultimately, guess what? You're going to have to retire at some point. You're not going to be able to keep up that same pace. You're not going to be able to do the same things. As time grabs a hold of us, we become limited on the things that we're actually able to do. That's why you don't see a whole lot of young people in church. because they're looking forward to the person that they can make themselves into and not the person that they need to be made into. That make sense? Okay, so, but the world tells you, look. They tell our kids this almost daily. They say, look at the person you could make yourself into if you just study hard and you work really hard and you can become this person, right? If you practice every day, football practice, you come and you put everything into it, you can play for the NFL. Now, is that a promise that can be fulfilled? Well, it could, but then it couldn't, right? It could, but then it couldn't, because there's a million stories of guys who had dreams of playing in the NFL and then ended up not, and it completely destroyed who they were, and they ended up just like an animal laying on the floor, right? Then they just become a ball of desire, and they chase after everything that their heart wants, and it ends up killing them and destroying them. And that's the reality of life, is when your dreams don't pan out the way you want them to, or what you had envisioned, people have a tendency to shake their fist at God and turn their back on him and run away. Just like Jonah, right? I don't want to save those people. Come on. How many times has that happened? Now that I think about it, in my own life, right? How many times have we done that, where we think that our story and the story that God has for us, well, they should be the same. But then when it doesn't pan out that way, we shake our fist and turn our back. It's easy to do because we're humans. We have autonomy. We've been given the ability to choose. So when he says, I've seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied, right? So is work a good thing or a bad thing? No. Well, it can be a bad thing if you place your identity on it. If your work becomes, in essence, your God, it becomes a bad thing. But if you realize that your work came from God, then you're actually working for God, right? And it doesn't matter if you're, I've heard this a lot. It doesn't matter if you're washing dishes or if you're, balancing the books for a Fortune 500 company, right? Or if you're playing in the NFL. If you base your identity on God, or your work, if you base your work on God and it's God-centered, then you have something that no one can take away from you. Because even the NFL player, and I've heard this story at least 5 times, if you're the NFL player and you've strived to be the person that God wants you to be, and a tragedy happens in your life, guess what? You've still got God. It's like, okay, let's open the next chapter of our story, not my story, of our story together. Because that's what a lot of times we get. It's so easy to get jaded and get lost in the idea that this is my story, and this is my life, and this is the way that I want to live it, right? So that's why Jesus, when he comes and he says, you know what? You got to give up your life in order to live. It doesn't make sense to people because they don't understand that your life is the very things that you've placed your identity in. Many people came to Jesus and they were like, well, look, I'm a rich young ruler. And Jesus is like, well, you got to give all that up. It's not that you have to give all that up. It's that you have to give up that identity of the person that you were, because you can't make it through this story without him. There's no NFL player who rose from the dead, right? And I don't think I have to convince you guys too much about that. But there's no accountant for a Fortune 500 company or whatever it is that people dream of being that rose from the dead. Like, people don't wake up in the morning and say, you know what? I want to be a poor prophet from the middle of nowhere and die for everyone else. Nobody does that. Nobody wants that identity unless they really understand it. Unless you truly understand it, then you want to be that person. So what he's saying is he's kind of flipping the paradigm, just like Jesus would flip the paradigm, right? It's like he would flip the paradigm a lot. Like, people would come to him and they'd be like, oh yeah, I'm the Pharisees, Nicodemus, for example. Check that one out, right? Like, this is the person I am. And then Jesus is like, nope, wrong, false start, start over. And then people throw that at him and they're like, well, Jesus, what am I supposed to do? Crawl back into my mother's womb and do this all over again? Trying to be sarcastic? Well, how'd that work out for Nicodemus? I mean, not too good, not too good. Right? So So this is what he's saying. He's saying in verse 11 here, he moves to this idea. And it seems like kind of a jump. If you're actually reading through it on your own, if you guys were astute enough to read through chapter 3 before I started teaching on it, you'd be like, whoa, wait a second. I don't get it. Because he has this, what profit has the worker from all his labors, right? And the God-given task to keep him occupied. And then he says, he's made everything beautiful in its time, right? And then he moves on and he says, also, he put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Now, this is a contrasting paragraph, right? He uses the work that men do to compare to the work that God does, okay? So God apparently has put eternity in the hearts of men, right? Apparently he's done that to human beings, to where you think you can spend all of your time in the future or the past, like I said before, right? Where you think you can spend all that time back there or way up there. Two places that you'll never be able to reach, not in reality. And you keep forgetting the moment. But apparently, God's work, who can know it, right? He's put eternity in your heart, but you can't even know eternity. Like, even if you try to start to think about it and wrap your mind around eternity, you'll find yourself, and just do this as a thought experiment later in the day, sit under a shade tree and it'll be raining. So get an umbrella and a shade tree, okay? I don't know if it's going to thunderstorm, but we get an umbrella and a shade tree and sit under the shade tree and try to think about eternity with your head, with the thing between your ears. Try to think about it because you can't grasp it. But your heart already knows it. Do you know that? Because your heart acts on instinct. And I think I said this last week. I kind of jumped on my own message, but I'll say it again, right? Reinforce the idea. Is that if you want to touch somebody, really, who's one of those staunch militant atheists like this guy was right here, you challenge them on their idea of mortality. You challenge them on their idea of mortality. Because if their worldview is true, and they give enough time to play it out, and everyone is just a bunch of molecules bumping together in a chaotic world that just has no meaning whatsoever, then why are you here? And if you're here, and none of this has any sense or meaning, why do you keep trying to place meaning on it? And here's Exhibit A, right? Exhibit A is that if you mortally wound an animal, the animal goes and finds a place to die comfortably. If you mortally wound a human being, without any thought, we don't even think about it. It comes from our heart. We go and we seek to be more uncomfortable in order to save our lives against every rational thought you could think about. Now, why would a human do that? And I'll get the answer a lot of times, self-preservation. You want to preserve yourself. But you've already figured out in your mind, logically, you've said that all this is meaningless and that the universe is just chaos bumping into chaos, right? They were all just a bunch of floating gas balls who just, there's no purpose or no reason or no anything behind it, right? Because that's the root of their worldview. That's the root of my previous worldview. So if that's true, then why not just find a comfortable place to die? Because the animal doesn't. The animal doesn't have eternity in its heart. Because here's the truth. Because your heart knows something your head doesn't. Your heart knows that you're not supposed to die. Your heart knows it, but your head doesn't. And the longest journey on any man's life is the journey from here to here. Right? So that always gets them thinking and scratching their heads. Because now you have to truly think about time and what you have to spend on this earth. And how limited it is, the few days that you actually have to accomplish something that you think is yours when in reality it's not. But here's the beauty of what the author is writing, right? This is the beauty of what the author is writing. Because the author wrote this with his own mortality in mind. He knew that he was just vapor in the wind. How many years ago was that? A long time, right? How many years after us will people be reading the same thing? A long time. So apparently, here's Exhibit A. If your work is for God, how long does it last? So if you're chasing after smoke, don't chase after smoke. Because that's what we do when we try to, okay, I'm going to take this job because it gives me more money. I'm going to take this job because I'll have more influence politically, socially, whatever it is. I'm going to take this job because this is what's going to do something for me, right? The thought should always be, well, this is the job that God has brought before me, and I'm going to do it in service of Him. Because it doesn't matter what you're doing, right? It doesn't matter if you're a construction worker, an electrician, whatever it is, just pick any job, right? If you do it for God, right? Well, think about an electrician, right? Now, is maybe silly, but I'm trying to staple this into your heads. Think about an electrician's job. He doesn't get up and preach every Sunday, right? He doesn't do that. But he keeps people's power going, right? And if he does it to the Lord, he does it for the Lord, then God remembers all the things that he did, and he did them for God in service to Him, His Heavenly Father. Then every day that he goes to work, he's serving God. Right? If a carpenter builds houses and he says, you know what, God? I'm going to build this house, and I'm dedicating it to you. This day is dedicated to who you are. How long does that house last? I'm not talking about here on earth, but the thing that he did, the very work that he did. If he did it for God, do you think God remembers it? Absolutely. How long does that last? So if a psalmist writes a book, and he writes a book to God's people with the intention of God in his heart, and he writes it, how long does that last? You're still looking at it, okay? You see how I'm trying to connect those two together? Is that your work today, the work that you dedicate to God, is actually eternal. Right? Now think about that when you go through your work day. Right? I know some of us don't work, but even if you're retired, you do work. You have influence over people around you. There is things that really feel like work to you. And I don't care what it is, right? If it's just mustering up the strength to come to church and be a positive influence, right? If it's just that, that's dedicated to God. If it's just mustering up the strength to push through the tears, to encourage someone else to be a better person, that's work done for God. Because the electrician, and the carpenter, they're maintaining creation. That's their job. And you turn back to page 1 in the Bible, what was man's job? God placed him in a garden to maintain creation, to bring it to new heights and new levels of what it could be. So whatever it is that's dragging you down, dedicate it to God. Whatever it is that you feel like you need to do and push forward through, whatever it takes to muster the strength to be the person that you're supposed to be, that time is no obstacle to God, and your work can last forever as long as you place it in the right place, as can your heart. So anyway, he's put this eternity into the hearts of men. So you see how that, okay, I hope I tied that together real well. If you have a question, please, because that's important. That's important to remember in your head, to get your head to line up with your heart and to realize what eternity is. To just sit and try to think about it, because you'll never come to it. You'll never come to eternity. You can't even fathom it in your brain. But your heart already knows it. Your heart knows it. It sings from there. So verse 12 here, and this is the conclusion he comes to after he's worked through it in his head, or tried to. He says, I know, okay, this is head knowledge. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, because it is the gift of God. Right? You see that? That in one breath, okay, and if you were an outsider and you didn't understand what he was trying to get at, right? This is so cool what he does, because he kind of masks the idea with this idea of this guy's crazy, right? Because you would think he's crazy. He's like, look at all this work that people do and they just give it away. Like, you go to the dust and then what? You're going to give all your stuff to some stranger and he's going to be in charge of your sandcastle, right? What we explored last week. You're going to give it to some stranger and then the tide's going to come and you're just going to write the deed off on somebody who could be a fool. And you've worked your whole life for this. Come on. Really? And then in the same breath he goes, because that's the gift of God, right? Enjoy it because it's the gift of God. And we look at it as Western thinkers, and we think of if and, right? So we draw a linear line of understanding. We try to. We try to draw a linear line of understanding. But if you really look at this poem, he goes in a circle. Because you cannot truly accept the gift that God has given you until you realize, and here's the truth of life, you can't really enjoy the things that you have. You can't accept the gift that God has given you until you realize it's a temporary gift. Did I have to repeat it? You guys got it? You cannot enjoy the gifts that God has given you until you realize that it's temporary. The person he sat next to you today, guess what? That person is temporary. They won't be here forever. That work that you do today is temporary. It won't be here forever. That thing that is become the centerpiece of your life, whatever it is, that person, that idea, that place, it's temporary. And God has given it to you as a gift. So you should enjoy it. Because otherwise you can't. Okay? So I'll give a silly example to try to reinforce this idea. Excuse me. So, teenager works all summer long and he gets his Corvette. And I don't know why I do teenagers in cars, because that just seems easy, right? It seems easy. Okay. Teenager, he works all summer long, and by some miracle, he saves up enough money for the Corvette, right? He gets the thing that he wanted, and then that winter he hits a patch of ice and he wrecks it. But the whole time, in between that summer of him buying that car and that winter, he spent every day polishing that car, doting over it, protecting it, trying to keep it safe from everything outside. He never actually drove it except for the one time that he hit the ice. So did he ever actually really enjoy that car? Right. He was trying to protect it from everything, thinking that he was in control of the story. So what happens to those people in your lives that you do that to? Because that's what leads to rebellion. Do you guys know that rules without love always leads to rebellion? Always. If I was to just tell my son, this is the way that life's going to be because I said so, and I don't project love into that atmosphere, you know what I have? The same thing Paul says you have without love. Nothing. You got nothing. Because the truth of the matter is that until you can realize that even your very life is temporary, you can't even enjoy it. You can't even start to enjoy it. Because you're going to be afraid of everything that may come and kill you. And I'm not even going to mention the thing that people are getting crazy about right now. Because you're going to fear it. It's going to cause your stomach to knot up. And you're not going to be able to, you're going to be like thinking about what happens. Your mind is going to start fixating on the future and what could happen and what will happen. And then you're going to try to change the story right now. You're going to change what you're doing right now and not enjoy the moment you're living in to try to affect the future that is coming. You guys get it? Because you will be robbed of your very life today. You will let fear take control of the person that you are and never reach the potential you are meant to be. Right? So, with that said, he moves on in verse 13, and here it says, come on, guys, wake up. Wake up. Think about your food. Eat and drink and enjoy the good of your labor, because that's the gift of God. And if that's not good enough for you, then, well, go work for the Corvette and see if you can actually enjoy it, right? See if you can actually enjoy it, because you won't. You won't be able to, because the things in your life are just things. The people in your life are people. And how much control do you have over people? I have none whatsoever. Like if I wanted to steer this congregation in a direction, how many of you, knowing that I'm steering, would actually follow? Right there. There's the number right there, right? If I wanted to see, here's the thing that's really interesting, is that I've been reading a lot of literature on how to grow a church and how to do those things. And I catch myself in the middle of Ecclesiastes here just going, oh, really? Because there's all kinds. I mean, I could fill this stadium up here, or this. I could fill this entire stage up here with books as tall as me on how to grow a church. Do you guys think Paul had any of those books? And how big did the church that he grow? I mean, there's a whole lot of denominations that read from Paul's letters, right? Okay, and even more so, Jesus. Do you think he read any of that literature? You think he was sitting there, and like as they're off sleeping, he's reading, the latest by Sinke or something about growing the church, right? No, he's not. Because the truth of the matter is that you have no power over that. You have no control over that. You can barely even catch the moment that you're living in right now. The moment you think about catching the moment you're living in, it's already gone. That's just crazy to me. How time continues to march on despite what I want it to do. I keep telling it. It's like a madman shouting at the sky, telling the sun to go away, right? As we sit here and we try to stop time by thinking about the past. See, I'll stop it. I'll show it. I'll show it my story. And the whole time, we can't even enjoy the food that we're eating, or the drinks that we're drinking, or the company that we're keeping, because we're so focused on controlling the narrative to the point that we want it. Did you know that 90% of psychological disease, brain disorders, actually come from a person trying to control the environment around them? Trying to control it and shape it into what they want it to be, rather than what it's supposed to be. I throw in the supposed to be part because the Journal of Psychiatric Medicine doesn't suggest anything like that. They actually say that masculinity is toxic, which I don't think that's true. I think they've lost their marbles as well, and they're trying to control the story on their own. So even our psychiatric institutes are crazy. And this seems like the only sane thing to me, is that when the guy says, you know what, you'll never actually learn to live until you're willing to put your life on the line. That's it. You'll never actually be able to taste your food until you realize that you might not have that ever again. That lasagna tastes so much better. You know what I mean? That food that you taste so much better is so much better when you think or you realize that you will never have it again. Guys on death row, they're facing their death. They have their last meal. What do you think that meal tastes like to them? Greatest meal ever made. The greatest meal ever made, because they know they won't have it tomorrow. What do you think the sunrise is to those people who are looking at death tomorrow, who know that it's inevitable? What does that sunrise look to them? What does it look like? It's the most beautiful sunrise that has ever existed. And every day you wake up, you look at that sunrise, or maybe you wake up late and you don't see it, but then you see the sunset. You look at that thing and you go, take it for granted. There's somebody out there that's the last thing that they'll ever see. And that's the most beautiful thing that they'll ever see. If you can actually learn to appreciate the things that you have today, like there is no tomorrow, you'll actually learn how to live the way that the Bible tells you to. If you're too busy trying to grab onto something that's already happened or look into the future, you lost it. You're just grabbing onto smoke. And the idea of eating and drinking, right? Like if you ultimately follow that story, you follow that story back to where it's in, the source of eating and drinking. Who planted all the seeds on the earth in the first place? Right? I like to garden, and these huge sunflowers come out of the ground, right? It's always boggled my mind that food just pops up out of the ground, right? And we have so many people that are hungry. It's like, well, you're not actually using your eyes. you just need to use your eyes, and you really won't be that hungry. But teaching people that is another matter altogether, because they like to cover it up with all kinds of socioeconomic problems and this and that. But the truth is, your food pops up right out of the ground, a ground that you didn't make. And it's the sun, that big orange ball in the sky, is what provides the light for those plants to grow. Right? And then there's rain that comes down, and it waters those plants. You know how much power you have over any one of those things? None. But in the same breath, I can say, if you don't weed your garden, if you don't pull the weeds out of your garden, your plants aren't going to produce. If you're not vigilant in looking at the garden that is your life, the weeds can overtake you. Right? That's why Paul uses that metaphor, fruit of the Spirit. So when you think about these things, they come They come whether you want them to or not. The sun, the rain, and the environment around you. It happens, whether you want it to happen or not. The thing is, how are you going to respond to it? That's the response. There's a whole book called the Book of Matthew that explores how people respond when the creator of all life steps into the world and enacts in that world. Did you think any one of those people actually had power over Jesus? No, not one of them did, right? For some reason when we pray, we think we can steer him in a certain direction or something like that, like Jesus, I really want that Corvette this summer, right? But what I like to call it is an adventure in missing the point. An adventure in missing the point. Because he moves into this poem right here. Another little poem inside of this one. In verse 14. It says, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken away from it. God does it that men should fear him. So that's really interesting because it's like the whole premise for the book of James. If you guys see a little annotation there, it's like God's going to do what he's going to do regardless of how you think or feel, right? And you can see examples of that, practical examples of that in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, because God doesn't really, he cares about something more than how you feel, right? Like the Pharisee and the tax collector. He cares about something more than how you feel in the moment right now. Because he knows how you feel and what your perspective is only temporary. Right? That like time, you're going to change and move too. Is he more concerned about you moving through time in a positive way or you moving through time in your own way? That's the real question. Because when people come to Jesus with their own agenda and who they think that they should be, he ultimately rejects them. When people come to Jesus and they say, this is the person that I am, and I need to be a different person, guess what they're met with? Acceptance. Because you can't make it through this story on your own. And he knows that. And he knows that if he comes and he brings you in, if he brings you in to the fold, and it's all about you and your story, is that going to help you or hurt you? It's going to hurt you because you think everything's all right. You think it's all okay. But the rejection, a lot of times, is what leads people to change. And that you see that in the story of Nicodemus. Because Jesus rejects Nicodemus. I mean, he calls him everything in the book besides, well, he kind of does. In between the lines, he just says that you're not wise, Nicodemus. Like, if I showed you earthly things, how can you understand anything heavenly? Then here's a guy who studied his whole life the Bible. And he can't even understand that he got a false start. He spent his whole life in it and completely missed the point. And that's the sad reality of life, is that you can spend your whole time in your life thinking that your story is about you, and Jesus can be right in front of your face. And guess who you never see? Jesus. But the moment you can let your guard down and actually realize that he is the one in control, then you have something. You have eternity, actually. You have everything. And what would you be willing to give for that everything? The nothing that I already have. Because that's what it is. So here's what that's what he's exploring. The idea of it, I kind of expanded it out a little bit. Okay, I opened up all the flaps and expanded it out. Because what he's saying is that replace where he puts God here with Jesus. And he says, I know that whatever Jesus does, it shall be forever. And what can we do? Can we add to it? Can we take away from it? We can't do anything to it. Because the moment we realize that we cannot shape God, we can't put him in a box, and we can't transform him into something that he's not, is the moment we get to truly appreciate him for who he is and what he's done for us. The moment we try to fix the narrative on what we think it should be, we lose it. And the moment we actually appreciate what he's done for us right now is when we gain it. So and that's what he's exploring. He says, and then in 15, verse 15, that which is has already been, and what is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. So you have control, but your control is only based on your perspective. And it's very limited control. And your amount of control really surmises to how much control you're willing to give to the one who truly has authority and control in your life. And moreover, okay, so here he's going to start laying it on thick. Moreover, because he's going back into he came out and he showed us some light there, right? He showed us a little bit of light, and then he's going to recess back into the darkness, right? He's going to recess back into the darkness because he wants to get this message across. And you know in your own life that you spend most of it up and down, left and right. You can never truly get a grasp on the reality that is right in front of you on a daily basis. Every now and then you get a glimpse or a taste of what it is, or who it is. Let me rephrase, of who it is. Every now and then you get a glimpse and a taste because you're willing to let your guard down that much to meet that person. And he says, so here he's moving back into the darkness to show us where we truly sit, or where we can sit. He says, moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. Now he's moving back. Can you see how he's moving back? He's saying where there's judges, this is life under the sun. This is life under the sun. If you notice, he uses this phrase kind of loosely. He uses life under the sun for all the people who have veils over their eyes, who place their identity in things that are strange. This is where I said you have three voices that are speaking. You have a critic, you have a teacher, and you have an old man talking to his grandson. So whenever you see the verbiage translate to under the sun, what we're talking about is people. This is like, think of all of a sudden we put the blinders on, okay? And what he's doing is he's saying, look, there's the judges. They're wicked. They just seek their own gain everywhere they go. That's what he's saying. He says, and look, where people are supposed to be righteous and be living in relationship together, they always are trying to stab each other in the back. Right? Just pick a city, okay? Pick a city, okay? Even some local small communities. So, and then he goes, and then if you notice, every time he moves under the sun from underneath heaven, right? He moves two ideas. If you notice, he starts talking to his heart again, right? He says, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. For there is a time, there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart, concerning the conditions of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals. So who's he talking to? He's talking to everybody who identifies with the Corvette. He's talking to people who are like, you know what, I'm going to be the professional basketball player. I. Because only I's live under the sun. The rest of us live, well, people in this room, I'm hoping, live in heaven, or live under heaven, right? And we live under the authority of heaven. The people who are ruled by the sun, right? Think about it. The sun is a bright thing. It's a big ball in the sky. And the people who think that they live under no authority except my own, right? This is my story, they're still ruled by the sun. Like, how many of them you think you can throw into utter darkness and they can find their way around? That's what the author is doing here, if you guys notice that. That's what Solomon is doing when he says under the sun. He's projecting people who have traded, like Paul would say it, who have traded their glory for the glory of the created things, okay? So even people who say that they're atheists, the sun rules over their days and their nights, right? Because there's not an atheist out there who goes, you know what? Today the sun's not going to rise, and I'm not going to get up out of bed. And because I didn't get up out of bed, this day didn't happen, I'm just going to mark it off the calendar, erase it. The world is completely different because of my perspective. There's not a single atheist who would do that. And even if they would, that's the most preposterous thing ever, right? Because you can try, but anyway, that's what he's exploring, because he says, well, really, people under the sun are a lot like animals, right? Because what do? Well, think about it. Here comes what they think is the worst catastrophe in the world, and what do? They buy up all the toilet paper. That's crazy. That's crazy. Well, look at them. Well, of course they would do that. What's funny, it's funny, but of course they would do that. Because every other decision that they've made leading them to this point in their life has been based on their own perspective and the way that they perceive the world. And I couldn't imagine a world where there was no toilet paper. But that's the drive to it, right? Like think of Psalm 2. Psalm 2, look at them down there. What are they doing? What are they doing? Isn't it funny, right? That's why he laughs on his throne when we do silly things. And I say we because we do it too. We do stuff that's silly. Like when we heard, honest confession right here. I don't have much time. I'm not going to eat into fellowship too much. So, honest confession. When I heard President Trump declaring a state of emergency, I actually got that knot in my stomach of fear. And I hadn't felt that in so long. You guys know that knot? Where you're just like my whole world has just collapsed. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. So I had to stop and evaluate the situation for what it truly was. Adam, you're feeling fear. Dad, why am I afraid? Oh, okay, I got it. So what it really is that, well, I've placed some of my hope and my identity in the leaders that I voted for. You know how bad of a thing that is to do? That little knot in my stomach reminded me, right? That little knot that he put there, that fear that I felt, reminded me that these people are still just people. That even the one who's supposed to project an era of not having fear has fear himself because he's placed his identity in the wrong place. And I know that my God isn't on the throne biting his fingernails, right? So if said whatever comes and takes me, I know who wins the story in the end. Right? I know who wins this story. I read the back of the book. I got the answer. Okay? So a lot of times, and this is really good. This is really good. A lot of times, the things that we're afraid of will become the things that we are. And if you don't believe so, just wait for the next time that little knot in your stomach happens, and then talk to Dad about it, like I've tried to teach you guys through the Psalms. The Psalms is always about talking to Dad. Prayer. I say it differently, a little bit differently, but prayer. When you pray your fear. When you pray your anxiety. When you pray your anger. Every emotion that you can possibly have, you pray it. Because the wrong place to put it is on the backs of the people who are next to you. And even worse is to put it on your own back, because you can't even carry your own hopes and desires. You don't even know that pool. You haven't even started swimming in that water yet, right? So where's the only person who can carry all my hopes and desires and even my emotional state? He was the one who carried the cross. So I enter into prayer. And when I enter into prayer, I realize that, wait a second, you're not biting your fingernails sitting on the throne. You're not really afraid of any of this stuff because you stood before it all. Why would I even be afraid? And the process of me living is the process of him showing me all the places where I need to trust him more. The places where I think I have control of my own story. Because that's what the author is saying. He's saying, this is think of like an evangelist and how he wants to till the soil. If you guys ever met a real evangelist, what they'll do is they'll call you everything but the kitchen sink, right? And they'll get you to admit it. And then once the soil is tilled really well, it's time to throw in salvation, right? Because there was a famous evangelist, and he said, if I got 10 minutes with somebody, I would spend 9.5 minutes talking about how terrible of a human being they are and 30 seconds talking about salvation. Because you cannot truly appreciate salvation until you realize how terrible you are. And you can't truly appreciate the people that God has put in your life or your very own life until you realize how temporary that thing is. And that's what he's doing right here. And he's talking to the people who have the blinders on, and he says, who knows? Verse 21, who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth. So I perceive that nothing is better, that man should rejoice in his own work, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Okay? So this is the evangelist going, yeah, guys, well, work is meaningless. Toil, all that stuff it's just worthless. It's vanity. It's smoke. Look at you. So here's the only thing that you can do with your short days on earth, is enjoy that smoke, right? Because you got several different voices going on, and you'll hear the one that speaks to you most. And this is the voice that's just going, huh? And whatever happens after you, whatever. Because that's what he does. That's what the evangelist does. He says, this is your life. Let me present it to you as this puff of smoke, because that's all it is. And then watch. All the people who were before you are gone. All the people who come after you, nobody will remember what they did. And the stuff that you're doing, guess what? It's already gone. It's already gone. The stuff you did yesterday is gone. You're trying to hold on to this thing, and then it's gone again. And that's the evangelist speaking, like, yeah, you know how terrible of a human being you are? What are you going to do about it? And that's why you only need 30 seconds to talk about salvation. Because that's how you really catch fish. Is you don't make the lure shiny. You don't make the lure really shiny. You make it stinky. And they think it's stinkier than they are. And they come to it, and they bite on it, and then it's time to show them that the place that they've been in is not going to lead to their life in the first place. So I'll just end with a word of prayer here. And I did cut into your fellowship time, and I apologize for that. But that's Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and identity. And that's why I preach on that so much. It's because we place so much on it. And we try to be something that we never were meant to be. Right? Amen?